It was just another ordinary day in the space station's repair bay. Dust and oil stains covered the floor, and the smell of burnt metal hung in the air. Most of the mechanics preferred fixing small cargo ships or shuttlecraft. They had routines and schedules, and they liked it that way. But today, something extraordinary had arrived, and no one wanted to touch it. The mechanic had been wiping his hands on a rag when he first noticed it. A massive ship, unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't sleek like the shuttlecrafts or bulky like cargo freighters. This ship looked alive. Its body was shaped like a dragon, with long metallic wings folded tightly against its sides, and a head that seemed almost breathing. Parts of it were scorched, some plates were bent, and pieces of the hull hung loose like broken scales. Sparks flickered from the engine compartment as if it were struggling to survive. The other mechanics had crowded around the bay's doorway, whispering to each other, shaking their heads. Too dangerous, one said. It might explode, another added. They had heard rumors about the dragon ship's legendary creatures of metal and fire, said to belong to an alien species that rarely showed mercy. No one wanted the trouble of fixing it, but the mechanic was different. He always liked challenges, even when everyone else turned away. He studied the ship from a few steps back, taking in every detail. He could see the patterns in the scales, the delicate engravings along its wings, and even the faint glow inside the cockpit. There was something about it that called to him, something that made him feel responsible. He ran a gloved hand along one of the bent plates. "Someone tried to fix you before," he muttered softly, almost like talking to a sick animal. But they gave up. He could almost feel the energy of the ship beneath his fingertips. It wasn't just metal. It had a pulse, a rhythm, as if it were breathing slowly, waiting for help. He glanced around. The other mechanics were busy with their own projects, too scared to approach. Taking a deep breath, he climbed a small ladder to reach the upper part of the ship. "Let's see what we're working with," he said quietly, though he was more talking to himself than anyone else. The first thing he noticed was the engine core. It had been damaged in some kind of explosion, and bits of wiring were hanging loose like torn veins. Some of the panels were scorched black, and a strange green liquid had leaked from one of the pipes. He frowned. He had fixed damaged engines before, but nothing like this. Nothing that had a pulse of life in it. He started with the basics, cleaning the burned areas and reconnecting wires where he could. As he worked, he spoke to the ship, half joking, half serious. "Hang in there, all right? I've got you." His voice was calm, but inside his heart was racing. Every spark, every hiss of escaping air made him tense, as if the ship might react. And in a way, it did. A faint vibration ran through the metal, as though acknowledging his presence. The hours passed. Night fell outside the station, and the other mechanics went home, leaving him alone. He didn't mind. He liked working alone. It allowed him to focus, to listen. He had a habit of talking to the machines he fixed, and this time he felt it more strongly than ever. "You're lucky I found you," he whispered. "Most people would have left you to rot." He crawled inside the cockpit, careful not to touch anything that could short-circuit. The inside was a mess of broken screens, shattered panels, and wires that hung like vines. He wiped his hand across one of the screens, and it flickered to life for a second. A soft hum filled the cockpit. It was faint, almost like a heartbeat. The mechanic froze. It was impossible, he thought. Machines didn't have heartbeats. But this one, it did. For the first time, he realized something important. This wasn't just a ship. It was alive, or at least it had something living inside it. Perhaps the pilot, or maybe the ship itself, had some kind of consciousness. He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing he couldn't give up. Not now. He worked through the night, repairing what he could, replacing broken panels with spare parts he had scavenged, and patching up the engine as best he could. The ship responded slowly. Panels hummed when he touched them. Lights flickered in time with his movements. And every so often, a low vibration ran through the floor like a purr dot by morning. He was exhausted. His hands were black with grease, and his uniform was torn in places. But when he stepped back and looked at the ship, something had changed. It didn't look like a dead, broken relic anymore. It looked alert, almost grateful. He smiled, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. The other mechanics arrived, rubbing their eyes and yawning. They were surprised to see him still there, hunched over the dragon-shaped ship. "You're still at it?" one asked, shaking his head. "I told you, it's hopeless." "I'm not giving up on this one," he said simply, climbing down from the cockpit. He didn't need to explain. He could feel it in his bones. The ship needed him. And somehow, he knew that helping it was bigger than just fixing a machine dot as the days turned into weeks. He continued working on the ship. Slowly, piece by piece, it came back to life. The wings could move again, though still stiffly. The engine hummed smoothly, and the lights glowed brighter. Sometimes, when he was alone, he could swear the ship was watching him or listening to him. Sometimes he spoke aloud, as if the dragon could understand. "Don't worry. You'll fly again," he whispered one evening, wiping sweat from his brow. And for the first time, the ship seemed to respond. A low, vibrating hum ran through the hull, almost like a sigh of relief that the mechanic didn't know it yet. But inside a hidden pod, the dragon pilot was awake, weak but conscious. It had been injured in a battle far across the galaxy, and it had been drifting in space for weeks before crash landing here. It had been afraid at first, unsure of whether the human would help or harm it. But as days passed and the human worked tirelessly, the dragon learned to trust him. Without even speaking, it had formed a bond with the mechanic, a bond of life-saving, care and quiet respect. The mechanic never saw the dragon's eyes, never knew it was watching him from the pod, but he spoke to it anyway. He treated it with patience and care, knowing in his heart that helping something in need was never wrong. The days were long, and the nights were lonely. But every time he saw a small spark in the engine or a panel light up, he felt a sense of pride and wonder that he had never felt before. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. His simple act of kindness, his decision to repair a broken ship when everyone else had turned away, was setting the stage for something incredible, something that would change his life in ways he could never imagine. And somewhere deep in the ship, the dragon pilot was learning the same lesson, that sometimes the smallest acts of care and trust could create bonds stronger than anything in the galaxy dot. By the time part one of the journey ended, the ship was no longer just a heap of metal. It was alive again, not fully, but enough to survive. And the mechanic, covered in grease and exhaustion, felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had ever known. He didn't know the future. He didn't know the adventures that lay ahead. All he knew was that he had made a difference. And sometimes that was enough. After the ship was mostly repaired, the mechanic continued his routine at the space station. But something had changed. Even though the dragon-shaped ship looked still and quiet, he could sense it wasn't just a machine anymore. There was a presence inside, something watching, something aware. He didn't see it, but sometimes when he worked late, he could feel a soft vibration under his feet, almost like a heartbeat. He dismissed it at first, thinking he was tired, but deep down he knew it was real. The mechanic didn't talk much to anyone about the ship. The other mechanics avoided it entirely, murmuring about how strange and dangerous it was. "It's not meant for us," one of them said, waving their hands nervously. But the mechanic couldn't turn away. There was something about the ship that called to him, that made him want to understand it. Every day, after finishing his normal repairs, he would go back to it. He would polish the metal plates. tighten the bolts, check the wiring, and every once in a while, he would speak to it. "You're lucky you didn't break completely," he said one night, running a cloth along the hall. "Most people would have left you here to rust. But I can't do that. You deserve better." It wasn't just talk. He meant it. And although he didn't know it, the dragon pilot inside could hear him. The pilot was weak, still recovering from injuries, trapped inside a pod that kept it alive but limited its movement. At first, it didn't understand the human, but over days and nights, it started listening. Every word the mechanic spoke, every gentle touch on the ship's hull, every careful repair, it mattered. The dragon pilot began to feel trust, a strange and unfamiliar feeling. Sometimes, when the mechanic worked inside the cockpit, the dragon pilot would try small movements. A faint twitch of the tail mechanism, a flicker of lights, a soft hum in the engine. Each time, the mechanic noticed, and without knowing why, he would smile. "I see you're trying," he would say softly. "Don't worry, I'll make it easier." The station was mostly empty at night. The low hum of machines and the occasional squeak of metal were the only sounds. Working alone, the mechanic felt a strange companionship with the ship. He talked to it as if it were a friend. "You don't have to thank me," he said once, adjusting a bent wing plate. "Just survive. That's enough." As the days passed, the dragon pilot began to respond more. Not in words, not yet, but in small ways that made the mechanic curious. Lights would flicker in rhythm with his heartbeat. A soft vibration would move through the floor when he walked. Sometimes, when he cleaned a damaged panel, the metal would seem warmer under his touch, like it was alive. He didn't understand it, but he didn't question it. He just kept working, letting the connection grow naturally. One evening, after a long day of repairs, the mechanic sat on a stool near the cockpit, wiping his hands with a rag. "I don't know who you are or what you are," he said quietly, "but I think you're more than a ship. You've been through a lot, and I'll get you back to where you belong." For a long moment, the station was silent. Then, faintly, a soft hum vibrated through the hull. The mechanic froze, heart skipping a beat. He looked around, expecting a malfunction or a loose wire. But everything seemed normal. And yet, the hum continued, low and steady, almost like a sigh. He shook his head, smiling nervously. "Yeah, okay. I guess you're awake enough to tell me you're alive," he murmured. He didn't know it, but the dragon pilot had tried to respond. It had listened, understood, and was learning how to communicate in subtle ways. It couldn't speak yet, but it could make its presence known, just enough for the mechanic to notice. Days turned into weeks, and the bond grew stronger. The mechanic started noticing patterns. If he was careful, the cockpit would adjust lights when he entered, as if welcoming him. When he was tired and rested against a panel, the ship would hum softly, almost soothingly. Even when he walked away to get tools, the vibration followed him, a silent acknowledgement of his care. The mechanic never expected gratitude from a machine, but somehow this felt different. He felt watched, but not in a dangerous way. It was a gentle presence, something alive, something thankful. He would talk to it as if it were a friend, telling it about his day, about small repairs he had done elsewhere, even about the other mechanics' chatter. "You'd be surprised what people complain about," he joked one night. And for the first time, it seemed like the ship understood him, its lights flickering in a subtle rhythm, almost like laughter. Sometimes he wondered about the pilot. Who was it? Where had it come from? Why had it crashed here? The station had seen ships from all over the galaxy, but nothing like this. He tried to imagine the pilot, injured and alone, trapped in a pod, relying entirely on him. The thought made him more determined. He couldn't just fix the metal and leave. He wanted to help the being inside, even if he didn't know what it looked like. Weeks later, the mechanic discovered the hidden pod inside the cockpit. It had a transparent cover, and inside, a faintly glowing figure stirred. His eyes widened. It was the dragon pilot. He could see its eyes opening slowly, weak but conscious, staring at him. The pilot's scales were pale, and its wings were folded tight, but there was life there. He froze, unsure what to do. He hadn't expected to see the creature awake. His mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "I've only been trying to help." The dragon pilot blinked, and slowly it seemed to understand. It didn't speak, not yet, but it gave a slight movement, a tilt of its head, as if acknowledging him. The mechanic felt a shiver run down his spine. For the first time, he realized that the connection wasn't one-sided. The pilot had been aware of him all along, silently observing, learning to trust, even though it was scared. From that night on, things changed. The mechanic worked more carefully, speaking gently, making sure every repair was precise. He noticed small things: the cockpit adjusting automatically, the wings twitching slightly, lights pulsing in time with his voice. The dragon pilot was alive, learning, and somehow forming a bond with him without words. At first, he doubted himself. Could a human and a dragon-shaped ship with a living pilot really understand each other? But the signs were undeniable. Every vibration, every hum, every subtle movement was a form of communication. He was no longer fixing a machine. He was helping a living being recover from near death. He spent long hours at the station, sometimes working through the night, always careful, always gentle. The dragon pilot, in turn, grew stronger, its subtle movements becoming more pronounced. The human couldn't see most of it, but he felt it. He felt life returning to the ship, and more importantly, to the being inside. One night, after finishing repairs, the mechanic sat on the floor near the cockpit, exhausted. He rested his head against a panel and whispered, "We'll get you back to the skies. I promise. Just a little longer." For the first time, the dragon pilot responded with a vibration that ran through the floor, soft and steady, like a heartbeat. The mechanic felt it clearly. It was a moment of understanding, silent but profound. Without words, they had connected. The mechanic knew that the pilot trusted him, and the pilot knew that the human was more than just a mechanic. He was a friend, a protector, someone who had saved its life. From that night onward, the mechanic didn't just repair the ship. He nurtured it, talked to it, and slowly, patiently, helped the dragon pilot regain strength. The station lights flickered softly over the hull as he worked, and the ship responded in kind. They had formed a quiet partnership, built not on fear or obligation, but on trust, care, and shared determination. And though the mechanic didn't know it yet, this bond would one day reach across galaxies, leading the dragon pilot to return to him, years later, stronger and wiser, seeking the human who had saved its life when it was at its weakest. For now, all that mattered was the work at hand, the patient repairs, the whispered words, the shared presence. Two beings, human and dragon, learning to trust each other, slowly healing together in a quiet corner of a busy space station. Weeks had passed since the mechanic first discovered the dragon-shaped ship, and by now he had grown used to the quiet presence of the dragon pilot inside. The ship no longer felt lifeless or broken. Its engines hummed steadily, lights flickered in rhythm with his movements, and tiny vibrations ran through the hull when he walked. It was as if the ship itself had learned to respond to him, acknowledging his care, his attention, and his patience. One night, as he tightened a series of newly repaired bolts on the engine casing, he noticed a subtle difference. The hum of the engine wasn't just steady anymore. It pulsed faintly, almost like a rhythm trying to match his own heartbeat. He froze, wiping sweat from his brow. Could it be? Was the ship responding to him in a new way? He leaned closer, listening carefully. A soft vibration ran through the floor, gentle but distinct, and the faint glow of the cockpit lights shifted as if acknowledging his presence. He stepped back slowly, unsure if his exhaustion was making him imagine things. "Okay, that's new," he murmured, half to himself. "You're not just awake, you're learning." For days, he observed the subtle changes. Every time he entered the cockpit, the lights adjusted slightly, almost like they were welcoming him. When he worked on the wings, they twitched faintly, as if testing their new strength. And sometimes, when he whispered to the ship in the quiet of night, a soft vibration would respond, a silent acknowledgement that the dragon pilot inside was aware, listening, and beginning to trust him more. Then came the night that would change everything. The mechanic had been working late, alone as usual, when he noticed a faint glow coming from the cockpit pod. The dragon pilot, usually still and resting, was moving slightly. Its wings flexed, testing their repaired joints. Its tail twitched. Its eyes, pale but luminous, opened just a little, revealing intelligence, awareness, and curiosity. The mechanic froze. "You're awake," he whispered, barely believing it. He carefully crouched beside the cockpit pod, careful not to startle it. "I won't hurt you. I promise." The dragon pilot tilted its head slightly, observing him. There was no fear, now only cautious interest. The mechanic could see that it was trying to understand him, trying to communicate without words. He took a deep breath, his heart racing, and spoke gently. "You've been through a lot. I know, but I've fixed what I can. You're safe here." A faint vibration pulsed through the floor, like a heartbeat matching his own words. The mechanic smiled, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and wonder. "You understand me," he said softly. "I think you understand me." Over the next few nights, the ship began to respond in more obvious ways. The wings would shift when he entered the cockpit. The engine's hum would fluctuate in rhythm with his voice, and lights would brighten as if reacting to his touch. It was subtle but unmistakable. The dragon pilot, once passive and weak, was now slowly awakening, testing its strength, and communicating in its own silent way. Then one evening, as he worked on recalibrating the navigation system, something unexpected happened. A low rumble started in the engine compartment, growing steadily louder. The mechanic froze, his hands on a wrench, eyes wide. The ship trembled beneath him. Sparks flickered along the repaired hull. And then, with a sudden surge, the cockpit pod's glass cover glowed brightly, illuminating the mechanic in an almost ethereal light. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes. The ship vibrated, not violently, but with undeniable energy. The wings lifted slightly, testing their full range for the first time since the repairs. And then came the voice, a low, melodic, alien sound that resonated deep within his chest. "Thank you," it said. The words were few, simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. The mechanic's eyes widened. He had never heard anything like it before. "You can hear me," he whispered, almost in disbelief. The dragon pilot blinked slowly, and the pod's lights dimmed to a steady glow, as if acknowledging him. For a long moment, the mechanic couldn't move. He had fixed countless machines in his life, repaired countless engines, but nothing had ever communicated back like this. Nothing had ever been alive in such a way. And yet, here it was, a being, alive and aware, thanking him for saving it. After a few moments of stunned silence, the mechanic cautiously approached the ship. He reached out a hand, not touching it yet, just hovering. I didn't expect this," he said softly. "I just wanted to help. I didn't think I'd hear you speak. The dragon pilot shifted slightly, and its glowing eyes followed him. There was intelligence there, patience, and something like gratitude. The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. This was no longer just a ship, no longer just metal and wires. This was a living creature, and he had played a part in saving it. Over the next several hours, they remained in that quiet, almost sacred space. The mechanic spoke, and the dragon pilot listened. It tried small movements, testing the wings and tail, flexing joints that had been repaired. The human continued his careful work, tightening panels, checking engines, and occasionally speaking gentle words. Each vibration, each pulse of light, each soft hum was a response, a conversation without words, a bond forming between human and dragon. By morning, the ship had stabilized. The pilot's movements were deliberate now, testing its abilities, learning its own strength after weeks of weakness. The mechanic stepped back, exhausted but elated. "You're stronger than I thought," he said softly. "Soon, you'll be able to leave if you want." The dragon pilot tilted its head, a gesture that the mechanic understood perfectly. It was testing him too, learning to trust him fully. And in that moment, he realized something profound. This bond, this silent understanding, was more than repair or survival. It was friendship, trust, a connection forged in patience, care, and quiet determination. Weeks passed, and the ship's awakening continued. The mechanic spent every free moment with it, ensuring the engines were stable, the navigation systems repaired, and the wings capable of full flight. At night, he would sit near the pod, whispering stories about his life, about small details of the station, even about the people who had avoided this ship entirely. And every night, the dragon pilot responded, sometimes with subtle vibrations, sometimes with flickering lights, and sometimes with the softest hums that sounded almost like laughter. The human began to notice subtle improvements as well. The ship's movements became more fluid. The engine's hum was no longer erratic, but steady and powerful. The wings could extend fully and retract without assistance. The pod's glass cover glowed softly at all times, responding to the human's presence and words. It was alive. It was aware. And it was ready. Then came the night when the mechanic, exhausted after hours of repairs, stepped back and watched as the ship moved on its own for the first time. The wings lifted fully, the tail flexed with strength, and the engines hummed at a steady, powerful rhythm. The ship was testing itself, and the mechanic felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had saved it. He had given it a second chance at life. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was just the beginning. The dragon pilot was awake now. It was learning, observing, and understanding. And one day, he realized with a quiet thrill, it might just leave, but it would remember him. For the first time, the mechanic allowed himself to imagine it, his quiet, solitary life suddenly touched by something extraordinary. A being from another world, alive and aware, had come to trust him completely. And the bond they had formed, silent but unbreakable, would shape the future in ways he could not yet imagine. That night, as he lay in his small quarters, he could still feel the faint vibrations of the ship through the floor. It was alive, powerful, and ready. And deep inside, he knew that the next step, the moment of departure, the moment the dragon pilot truly spread its wings, was coming. And when it did, everything would change. The nights at the space station had grown quieter. The mechanic had become accustomed to the subtle presence of the dragon-shaped ship, and the bond between him and the dragon pilot had deepened. Every hum of the engine, every vibration under his feet, every flicker of light felt like a conversation. He knew the ship was awake, aware, and growing stronger. But he still hadn't imagined what was about to happen. It started on a night when the station itself seemed unusually still. The usual hum of machinery and distant chatter of passing ships were absent, leaving a deep silence that made the mechanic uneasy. He had been checking the ship's engines, making sure every wire, bolt, and panel was perfectly aligned. The Dragon pilot was resting in its pod, quiet and still, but the faint glow from inside hinted at life. Suddenly, without warning, a low vibration ran through the entire floor of the bay. It was different from the usual hum, a deep, steady pulse that made the walls tremble slightly. The mechanic froze, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced around nervously, unsure what was happening. Sparks flickered along the edges of the hull, and a soft glow radiated from the engine compartment. Before he could react, the cockpit pod's glass cover began to rise slowly, as if lifted by some invisible force. The Dragon pilot's eyes opened fully, glowing with a bright, almost ethereal light. The wings twitched, testing their strength. The tail flexed with power. And then, with a sound like rushing wind, the engines roared to life. The mechanic stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the intense light. The ship vibrated and trembled, but it wasn't out of control. It was awakening fully, testing its power and asserting its presence. The low hum became a deep, resonant roar that filled the bay, echoing off the metal walls. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Whoa! The mechanic whispered, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. He had repaired the ship, nurtured it back to life, but he hadn't expected this. It wasn't just alive now. It was aware, powerful, and fully functional. The ship began to rise slowly, lifting off the ground in a controlled motion. The mechanic could feel the vibrations under his feet as the landing struts retracted. Sparks flew from the edges where repairs had been tightest, and the metal creaked, but the ship held together. Its wings extended fully, testing their range, and the cockpit pod shifted to align perfectly with the hull. The mechanic's heart raced. He knew that this was the moment of truth. The Dragon pilot, the being he had saved and cared for, was about to leave. And he wasn't sure if it would ever come back. Wait, he called softly, stepping closer, unsure if he could stop it. Don't go yet. The Dragon pilot seemed to understand, but it didn't stop. Instead, it hovered a few meters above the floor, powerful and majestic, waiting. Its eyes met his, and in that gaze, he could feel something profound. There was gratitude, yes, but also understanding, intelligence, and a silent promise. It would remember him. It would never forget what he had done. Then, with a sudden burst of power, the ship shot upward, piercing the station ceiling and breaking into the night sky. The mechanic stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the glow as the dragon-shaped ship disappeared into the stars. Sparks fell from the edges of the bay where it had hovered, and the floor vibrated as if the building itself had felt the departure. For a moment, the mechanic stood there, stunned, unable to move. He felt a mixture of awe, pride, and emptiness. He had saved the ship. He had helped the Dragon pilot recover. And now it was gone, leaving him alone in the bay for the first time in weeks. He walked over to the spot where the ship had been, touching the floor as if hoping to feel the presence again. But there was nothing, only silence. The bay smelled of burnt metal, oil, and ozone from the engines. He swallowed hard, realizing the truth. He had nurtured a being back to life, and it had chosen to return to the stars. Over the next few days, the mechanic tried to continue his work as usual, but nothing felt the same. The other mechanics noticed a change in him. "You've been distracted," one said cautiously. "Everything all right?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. How could he explain that the being he had saved, nurtured, and grown to care for had flown away? That it had risen into the night sky, powerful and majestic, leaving him behind? He didn't try. He simply returned to his work, but his mind kept drifting to the ship, wondering where it was, whether it was safe, whether it remembered him. And then came the whispers. Rumors started to circulate among the few travelers who passed through the station. Stories of a dragon-shaped ship that had appeared suddenly in the sky, powerful, glowing, and almost alive. Some called it a ghost. Others claimed it was a myth. But the mechanic knew the truth. It was the ship he had saved. It was the dragon pilot he had cared for. And somewhere out there, it was flying freely, testing its wings, exploring the galaxy, and carrying a silent memory of him. At night, he would sometimes step outside the bay and look up at the stars, imagining the ship gliding among them. He could almost feel its presence, a faint vibration in his chest, a reminder of the bond they had formed. "Be safe," he whispered softly into the empty sky. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this departure, was not the end. The dragon pilot had experienced life at the edge of death, had been nurtured back to strength, and now it carried a debt of gratitude that would last a lifetime. Somewhere in the vastness of space, it would remember the human who had saved it. And one day, years later, it would find him again. Back in the station, life slowly returned to normal. The bay was quiet, the other mechanics continued their work, and the hum of smaller ships filled the space with familiar sounds. But for the human mechanic, everything had changed. He had glimpsed something extraordinary, touched something alive in a way he had never imagined, and learned a lesson about patience, trust, and the power of care. He returned to his workbench, repairing smaller ships and shuttles. But his mind often drifted to the dragon-shaped ship. He thought about its wings, its glowing eyes, and the faint vibration that had accompanied him for weeks. He remembered the soft hums, the gentle responses, and the moment it had thanked him with its first words. That memory became a quiet comfort, a reminder that his actions had mattered, and that even in the vastness of the galaxy, bonds of trust and care could leave a lasting impact. Sometimes he caught himself smiling for no reason, remembering the way the cockpit lights had flickered in response to him, or the way the wings had tested their strength before lifting off. It was a small, secret joy that no one else could understand. He had touched something extraordinary, something alive, and it had acknowledged him. Weeks passed, and although he tried to focus on his daily work, he often found himself stepping outside the bay at night, looking at the stars, wondering where the dragon pilot had gone. The emptiness he felt was mixed with pride. He had saved a life that many would have considered hopeless, and that life had flown free and strong. Because of him, he began to notice small things around the station, reminders of the ship. The vibration of passing cargo ships felt different now, almost familiar. The hum of the engines in the larger bays reminded him of the subtle purr of the dragon pilot ship. Even the way the light reflected off the metal walls made him think of its glowing cockpit. It was as if the memory of the ship lingered, not just in his mind, but in the space itself. And though he didn't know it yet, the dragon pilot had not forgotten him. Somewhere in the endless stretch of stars, it was searching, remembering the human who had saved its life, nurturing a bond that time and distance could never break. The day would come when their paths would cross again. For now, the mechanic worked in quiet solitude, carrying the memory of the ship, the gratitude of the dragon pilot, and the knowledge that a small act of care could have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. He had saved a life, and that life had flown free. And one day, when he least expected it, the dragon pilot would return. Years had passed since the dragon-shaped ship had lifted off from the space station. Life had returned to normal, at least on the surface. The mechanic continued his work, repairing smaller ships, maintaining engines, and occasionally helping travelers pass through the station. But no matter how busy he became, there was always a part of him that remembered that extraordinary night, the night The dragon pilot had awakened and flown into the stars. He often found himself looking up at the night sky, imagining the glowing ship cutting through space. He thought about its wings, its glowing eyes, the subtle hums that had once responded to his voice. And in those moments, he could feel a quiet connection, almost like a heartbeat shared across light years. It was comforting, but also bittersweet. He had saved the dragon pilot, nurtured it back to life, and now it was out there somewhere, alive and free, but distant. Then, one evening, as the station hummed with the usual activity of incoming and outgoing ships, something unusual happened. The ground beneath the bay trembled slightly, faint at first, but growing steadily. Sparks flew from the edges of nearby machinery, and the lights flickered briefly. The mechanic paused, his hand resting on a wrench, eyes narrowing as he scanned the bay. Something was coming down at first. He thought it was another cargo ship passing too close, or perhaps a minor tremor in the station's structure. But the vibrations were too deliberate, too strong. And then he saw it. A shadow passed over the bay, larger than any ship he had seen in years. The lights flickered again, as a bright glow appeared outside the windows. The dragon-shaped ship, fully grown, fully powerful, and unmistakably alive, was descending from the sky. The mechanic's heart leapt in disbelief and excitement. It couldn't be it had been years. And yet there it was, returning to him. The ship landed with a controlled grace, wings folding in slowly, tail curling lightly behind. The engines hummed steadily, filling the bay with a familiar vibration that ran through his chest. It was as if the station itself recognized the presence of something extraordinary. The mechanic stood frozen, unable to speak at first. He had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was overwhelming. He felt a mix of joy, awe, and disbelief. Slowly, he stepped closer to the ship, reaching out instinctively. You came back," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't think. I never thought you'd find me again." The cockpit pod opened, and the dragon pilot stepped out. Its scales were brighter now, stronger and healthier than he had ever seen. Its wings were fully developed, stretching wide as it shifted its weight gracefully. Its eyes, glowing with intelligence and recognition, locked onto his. The mechanic felt a warmth in his chest, a connection he hadn't realized had remained alive all these years. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. No words were needed. The dragon pilot had traveled countless light years, survived unknown dangers, and had come here with a single purpose: to find the human who had saved its life. The mechanic's hands trembled as he took a step forward. I can't believe it," he said softly. I thought I'd never see you again." The dragon pilot responded in a way he had never forgotten. A low, resonant hum ran through the floor, the same sound that had greeted him years ago when it first awoke. The vibration carried a message, a greeting, a recognition, and a promise all at once. The mechanic smiled, tears forming in his eyes. "I never stopped hoping," he whispered. "I never forgot." They spent the next few hours together, though there was little need for words. The mechanic checked the ship, making minor adjustments to ensure it was safe to remain in the bay. The dragon pilot observed, its glowing eyes following his every movement. It shifted its tail slightly, testing the floor, flexing its wings, and making small, deliberate movements that showed both strength and restraint. The mechanic realized something profound. This was not just a ship. It was a living being, a creature of intelligence and emotion, capable of remembering, feeling, and understanding. And it had chosen to return to him, not out of obligation, but out of trust and gratitude. That realization filled him with a quiet, overwhelming pride. As the night passed, the station grew quieter. Most of the other mechanics had gone home, leaving him alone with the dragon pilot. He spoke gently, telling it about the years that had passed, about the repairs he had done, and about the changes in the station. The dragon pilot listened, responding occasionally with subtle vibrations, flickers of light, and the soft hums that had always conveyed its emotions. "I never thought I'd see you again," the mechanic said, sitting on a nearby crate. "And now, here you are. All this time? You remembered me?" The dragon pilot stepped closer, its head tilting slightly, eyes glowing brighter. The message was clear. Yes, it remembered. It remembered the care, the patience, the quiet hours spent repairing not just the ship, but the life inside it. It had not forgotten, and it had returned because of that bond. The mechanic reached out slowly, placing a hand on the edge of the cockpit pod. The dragon pilot lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging his touch. The warmth of the moment, the connection they shared, filled the bay with an unspoken understanding. He realized that the years of separation had only strengthened their bond. The trust they had built had survived time, distance, and the challenges of the galaxy dot over the next few hours. He walked around the ship, inspecting it carefully, making small repairs, and adjusting panels. The dragon pilot observed, occasionally moving a wing or tail in response. The air was filled with a sense of calm and purpose. They were together again, and the bond between human and dragon was stronger than ever. Finally, the mechanic sat down, exhausted but content. "You're safe now," he said softly. "And I'm glad, so glad, that you came back." The dragon pilot let out a low hum, the sound resonating through the bay like a soft, living heartbeat. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of gratitude, and a promise that this was not the end of their story. The human smiled, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment he had never known before. He had saved a life, and now that life had returned, stronger and wiser, carrying with it the memory of their bond dot as the night passed and the stars glittered outside, the mechanic and the dragon pilot remained in the bay together. Words were few, unnecessary even. Their connection, built over years of care, patience, and trust, spoke louder than any language. It was a bond forged in quiet moments, in whispered encouragements, and in the shared understanding that sometimes a simple act of kindness could create a lifetime of gratitude that by the time dawn broke, the station was quiet. The mechanic looked at the dragon pilot, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of completion. They had reunited. The dragon pilot had returned. And though the future was uncertain, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This bond, this trust, this connection would never fade. And somewhere deep inside, he understood that the dragon pilot's return was more than gratitude. It was a promise that their lives, though different in so many ways, were now linked forever. The reunion had brought a calm sense of joy, but life was far from over. The dragon-shaped ship, now fully healed and powerful, had returned to the human mechanic not just to thank him, but to form a bond that would last a lifetime. Over the next days, the mechanic spent nearly all his waking hours with the dragon pilot. Together, they explored every corner of the ship, tested its systems, and strengthened the connection that had started years ago. The bay, once quiet and empty, now felt alive again. The hum of the engines, the faint vibrations through the floor, and the soft flicker of lights from the cockpit created an atmosphere that was almost magical. The mechanic had worked on countless machines before, but none had felt like this alive, aware, and capable of forming a relationship that went beyond human comprehension. Each morning, he would walk through the ship, checking the engines, tightening panels, and speaking softly to the dragon pilot. The pilot responded in small ways, movements of the wings, flickers of light, gentle vibrations through the floor. Every gesture conveyed trust, understanding, and recognition. Over time, the mechanic began to realize something he had suspected for years. This was no longer just a ship, and this was no longer just a pilot. It was a being with its own thoughts, feelings, and awareness. And it had chosen him as its companion. One morning, while testing the navigation systems, the mechanic noticed the dragon pilot observing him intently. Its glowing eyes followed every movement, every gesture. He paused, unsure how to interpret the attention. "You're curious," he said softly. The pilot let out a low hum, the vibration carrying through the floor, almost like a nod. It was learning, thinking, and understanding. Over the weeks that followed, they began training together. The mechanic carefully tested the ship's capabilities, while the dragon pilot adapted to its renewed strength. Wings that had been broken now extended fully, engines roared with power, and systems that had been damaged now operated smoothly. It was exhilarating, and the mechanic couldn't help but marvel at the progress. Every test flight, every minor adjustment, brought a new sense of accomplishment. And yet, what thrilled him most wasn't the technical improvements. It was the growing connection between them. The dragon pilot had returned not just for survival, but to maintain the bond they had formed years ago. It remembered every repair, every gentle word, every quiet night when he had cared for it without expectation. The mechanic realized that this bond had changed him as much as it had changed the dragon. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a friend, a caretaker, and a partner in something extraordinary. One evening, after a particularly long day of testing the engines, the mechanic sat on a crate near the cockpit. The dragon pilot hovered nearby, wings partially extended, tail curling gently behind. He looked up at the glowing eyes that met his own and whispered, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" The dragon pilot responded with a soft hum that resonated deep within him. It was more than sound, it was communication, understanding, and affirmation all at once. They didn't need words. The bond between them was stronger than anything spoken. As days turned into weeks, they began to venture further. The mechanic had repaired and calibrated every system on the ship, making it ready for long-distance travel. They tested new maneuvers, flew through the station's outer corridors, and even navigated small asteroid fields to see how the ship and its pilot would respond. Each test was a learning experience for both of them. The dragon pilot had grown stronger, more aware, and increasingly independent. Yet it always stayed close, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The mechanic began to understand that this bond was rare. It was not just about saving a life. It was about trust, respect, and shared experience. He had nurtured the dragon pilot back from near death, and in return, the pilot had not forgotten him. Even after years apart, it had returned, not as a passenger, not as a machine, but as a companion. That understanding filled him with a quiet, overwhelming pride. One day, while checking the propulsion system, the mechanic noticed something remarkable. The dragon pilot was mimicking his movements, learning from him in real time. Every adjustment he made, every calibration, it observed and responded to. It was as if they were dancing in unison, two beings moving together with purpose and precision. The mechanic laughed softly. "You're learning fast," he said. The pilot responded with a gentle vibration, almost like a chuckle. Over the following months, their relationship deepened further. The mechanic shared stories of his life, small details about the station, and his hopes for the future. The dragon pilot listened, responded in subtle ways, and gradually began initiating small actions on its own. Sometimes it would adjust lights, hover closer, or flex its wings as if inviting the mechanic to notice. These moments were small, but significant. They were signs of trust, understanding, and shared joy. Then came a day when the mechanic realized something profound. They were no longer separate. They were a team. Every action he took, every repair he made, every flight they tested together was a collaboration. The Dragon pilot had regained its strength and awareness, but it had chosen to remain with him. It could have ventured into the galaxy alone, powerful and free. Yet it stayed, not out of obligation, but out of trust and loyalty. The mechanic's heart swelled with emotion. He reached out and placed a hand on the ship's hull. "We've come so far," he whispered. "I'm glad. I'm glad you're here with me." The Dragon pilot responded with a low hum that pulsed through the floor, a living heartbeat that reassured him. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. They were bound together now, by trust, by shared experience, and by the quiet understanding that had grown over years. Over the next few weeks, they continued exploring the station, testing new maneuvers, and preparing for journeys beyond. The mechanic marveled at the ship's capabilities, while the Dragon pilot responded with precision and awareness. Together, they discovered new ways to communicate, share tasks, and anticipate each other's actions. It was a partnership unlike any other. One evening, as the station's lights dimmed and the stars glittered outside, the mechanic sat near the cockpit, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the day the ship had first arrived, broken and near death. He remembered the long nights of repairs, the moments of doubt, and the careful patience required to nurture the Dragon pilot back to life. And now, here they were reunited, stronger, and ready to face whatever the galaxy might bring. The Dragon pilot hovered nearby, wings partially extended, tail curling gracefully. Its glowing eyes met his, and in that gaze he saw recognition, gratitude, and a deep, unspoken bond. He realized that the connection they shared had transcended time, distance, and circumstance. It was not just survival. It was friendship, loyalty, and a shared journey. The mechanic smiled, feeling a warmth he had never experienced before. "We've come full circle," he said softly. "You've come back, stronger and wiser, and we're together. Nothing else matters." The Dragon pilot responded with a gentle hum, a living heartbeat that filled the bay with a sense of calm and fulfillment. The mechanic knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. He had saved a life once, and that life had returned, not just as a ship, but as a companion, a friend, and a partner. And so, the story of the human mechanic and the dragon-shaped ship reached its conclusion, not with an ending, but with a beginning. Together, they were ready to explore the galaxy, face new adventures, and strengthen the bond that had been forged in patience, care, and trust. They were no longer alone. They were a team dot as the stars shimmered outside the station and the engines hummed softly. The mechanic reached out once more, placing a hand on the glowing hull. "We are ready," he whispered. "Together, we're ready for anything." And in that moment, the Dragon pilot pulsed with light, the engines hummed stronger, and the bond between human and dragon, forged in years of patience and trust, became unbreakable. The adventure had only just begun.